Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last live chat in our series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships Program. My name is Murab Sarwar. I'm the recruitment director here at STPF, and I'll be your moderator today. This live chat series is an opportunity for you to ask STPF and our fellows your questions. And we hope that through these chats, you'll see how through the fellowship you can impact policy and still have a transformative experience. Cool. On to a few housekeeping items. We are in the last month of the current application cycle. Applications are still due by November 1st of 2025. Complete applications must be submitted by November 1. This includes verification of all your application materials and receipt of all letters of recommendation. These fellowships are an opportunity for doctoral level scientists and engineers to spend a year contributing their expertise to federal policy and are a paid 1 year full-time commitment in Washington, D.C. For a sense of timing, someone who applies in 2025 will be considered for a position in the fellowship class that runs from September of 2026 to August of 2027. A lot of changes to our fellowship areas and program areas that you can apply to. As always, though, applicants can still apply through our executive, legislative, and judicial program areas. Of those three, you can apply to two in any given year. And then new for 2025, applicants can now also directly apply to the legislative branch in artificial intelligence. You might have formerly known about this as the rapid response cohort in AI. It's a specialized opportunity that places fellows directly in Congress to provide AI expertise and legislative decision-making. If you're applying to a legislative program, you do have to pick between either the legislative branch or the specific legislative branch in an AI cohort. And then also new for 2025, we're offering an optional third application. It's called the Pathways to Policy Fellowship. And through this, fellows would utilize their subject matter expertise to ensure scientific evidence that influences policymaking in settings that are outside of the federal government. So that can include nonprofit organizations, corporations, or think tanks. If you are applying to two program areas, you can add Pathways to Policy as a third application. However, if you could only include Pathways to Policy if it's a third, or if you are at least applying to one other branch. I also wanted to briefly touch on eligibility. Our applicants must be U.S. citizens that hold a doctoral degree in the sciences, social sciences, or engineering, and cannot be full-time federal or AAAS employees. Those of you with a master's in engineering plus 3 years of professional engineering experience are also eligible to apply. But really, you all here are representing many different backgrounds from biological and physical sciences to social sciences and computer sciences and engineering. Really, that diversity of discipline is important to us. Our partners and our offices that host fellows are looking for a wide range of backgrounds and skills. And then to put today's session in context, we've hosted one chat each month this summer, which means that today is our last chat for this year's series. We're glad that you're here today and invite you to watch past recordings. Each chat will focus on a unique aspect of the fellowship experience, and you'll get to hear from different STPF fellows at each. So always big Rolodex for you to look through. And today's chat is really just focused on the actual application and for some last minute tips and strategies. So on to the purpose of today's session is to chat with us in the program. So please ask to do that. Click the question box in the menu on your screen and type your question in. And if you like, you can indicate the person or people to whom your question is directed to. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. And I'm happy to introduce you to our guest fellow joining us for today's discussion. Elizabeth Akinbiya is a biomedical scientist and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship alumni who recently served in a legislative policy role with the federal health landscape. She brings over a decade of experience across biomedical research, higher education, and science policy with a strong commitment to advancing equity in STEM. Elizabeth is passionate about making science accessible and building bridges between research, policy, and real-world impact. She speaks from her own perspective and lived experience navigating the intersections of science and policy. Thank you for joining today, Liz.
I'm excited to be here.
Before we kind of go into questions from the audience, but wanted to kick one us one. I can not speak today. Kick it off with one to start. If you could just tell us a little bit about your background and what initially drew you to apply for the AAAS STPF Fellowship, and what were some of the key factors or experiences that you think made your application successful?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My background is in biomedical sciences, specifically within oncology, immunology, and neuro-oncology, specifically glioblastoma. So while I did enjoy lots of aspects of the lab, I knew that I loved communicating science when I went over to conferences that were national, local, within the school. I really liked communicating about the science. I found it to be really enjoyable. And I pretty quickly knew I did not want to continue on the postdoc faculty route, and science policy caught my attention and it really piqued my interest. So I did a lot of research. I came across the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and I felt like my background would be a great way, my health biomedical background would be a great way to merge my interest in communicating science, my scientific expertise, and wanting to educate and advocate for sound science policy.
Awesome. I think there's like some of the questions that are already popping up. And so there's one about kind of like the different program areas and things that lined up that way. Would you want to maybe share kind of your pathway to deciding where you applied and what kind of like made you go on that route to eventually end up at NIH?
Yeah, sure. I chose to apply to the executive branch because I knew I wanted to have a 2-year experience. I thought that 1 year would be too short to just be in and out. I kind of felt like by the time I felt like I was getting my feet underneath me, that the fellowship would be coming to an end in like another few months. So I chose the executive branch because of the length of it. However, I still ended up doing 2 1-year placements in 2 separate offices at the NIH. But I wouldn't trade it. I really loved my experience. And so that's one of the reasons why I chose the executive branch because it gave me the 2-year runway.
Yeah. There's a question here about, applying through a partner organization. And so for folks who are interested in the legislative branch, there's a few ways to do that. So if you're thinking about applying through us for the executive or pathways policy or legislative, you can still apply to AAAS, but if you can also apply through a partner society as well, if you're set on doing the legislative side, and other fellowship programs like we'll do other things. Like there's a question about CCST, which is a state fellowship program, which is great. But for folks who are interested in that federal landscape, like you did, that's kind of the pathway that separates us from those other groups. Um, cool. Something else I was hoping you can maybe get into too is how you were able to demonstrate your policy experience or interest in applying for the fellowship. I think something that I get a lot when I'm sitting on the table is like, oh, I'm not really involved in policy, or this is like a different career path, um, or I'm like really technical based or lab based. Um, how did you maybe highlight that in your application, or what's something that applicants can use uh, to kind of like still apply for the program, even if they don't have that
Yeah.
specific policy skill set right now?
Absolutely. I took the path of curiosity and initiative a little bit. So I was fortunate to have a national conference that was within my scientific field come to DC, and they had a Capitol Hill Day. And so I applied to go to the Capitol Hill Day, but I was not selected because they had an overwhelming response. And so they just couldn't accommodate everyone. But something that they shared with us was that we could also get involved locally. And so I turned to look what was going on my campus and found that there was a science diplomacy student organization on campus. By the time I got into this organization, the pandemic had hit, and so we were no longer doing things in person. A lot of the things were virtual, either they were virtual phone calls or ways that we could volunteer and help in our local community and society, which I was in Cleveland, Ohio at the time. So, what that would look like. Um, so, someone that wants to demonstrate that they have some expertise or experience, I think you can always start small, whether it's one example was that I was also the student government for all of the graduate schools. There's like 8 or so graduate colleges or schools at Case Western where I went to grad school, and I was the student president. I was elected as president there, and I would advocate for the students with meeting with the then president, Barbara Snyder, monthly to talk about different things that were important to the student body. And so that was a way in which I could show that I was advocating for the student body, and that gave me some experience. So within my application, I talked about that experience. I talked about the science diplomacy, student organization, and also just staying abreast to what's happening. Like I mentioned, my dissertation research was on glioblastoma. There was, when I applied recently, um, a senator introduced a resolution to have there be the designation of July 21st as the Glioblastoma Awareness Day. So just being aware of certain things like these that I could mention in my application, I felt helped my application be more well-rounded and showing my interest and my initiative that I took to be involved and aware.
I think too, like that skill set is developed throughout your entire career, right?
Yeah.
And still kind of like being able to leverage different aspects to eventually your placement, right? And so I think a lot of folks will kind of like build up this idea that like they're not policy experts in applying, but in reality, that's like the purpose of the program, right? Is we want you to kind of like come in with this and then get this experience out of it. And so I think that's what we try to do. Um, Anything from like maybe your kind of like experience in the fellowship that you took out of that is kind of like really like you were able to for either leverage your policy interest or experience into the fellowship that maybe like showed up in your time at NIH?
Absolutely. The second placement I had at the NIH was in the Office of Legislative Policy and Analysis, OPA, and my background was instrumental. So they are the office that deals with all things Congress. So that if Congress has an inquiry, they want a briefing, they want to have information, they want to have meetings, that office is a coordinating office to make sure that NIH is in compliance with all things Congress. So there was a variety of things I got to do. One of the things was to help coordinate the initial FY 26 congressional justification for NIH's then $47 billion in agency budget. And so this was a 40 chapter um, I say like 40 chapter CJ, Congressional Justification. And it took my lens and having some background in biomedical research and science to help edit and help move it along the review process. So I was not only moving it along the review process, but also reading each chapter many times over just to make sure that the science was well conveyed. It was smooth and concise, that someone that was on the Hill that may not have a science background could really understand this. So if I thought that this took a lot of my biomedical knowledge to understand, I would write back to the authors and say, can you make this more layman's term? For example, that was something that I think was really helpful.
And I think that shows up going forward for so many things, right? I think it's so much of kind of like how do you communicate the stuff that you're doing and going from there. A few questions about the letters of recommendation. I think there's like one question on if they on if applicants should have different references for different program areas. It doesn't have to be that way. It's more if they can kind of like speak to your skill set and ability, but if they did have like if you really thought that your references can speak in different aspects of you to really match program area, that could be a good call. But up to you. You're allowed to have a different set of references, or you can pick the same. But Liz wanted to ask you, like, what was your relationship with your recommenders, and kind of like if you could maybe like speak to like that your process and getting recommenders to fill out the application and what our applicants should be thinking about.
Absolutely. I was fortunate to have a research experience that was towards the end of my undergrad, immediately after, and then also another graduate research experience. So I had research from undergrad and grad research experience. And so I had the PI whose lab I was in undergrad write one of my letters. I was associated with his lab for about 2.5 years. And there also was a couple publications that ended up coming out from that lab that I was on. So I felt like he had a great grasp of my evolution as a scientist and being able to present and communicate science in a very concise manner. So I asked that PI. And then I also had um, two individuals from my graduate program. I had one that was within my graduate program. He was actually the head of the immunology training program within the Department of Pathology at Case Western. And I also had one of my co-mentors, right, that was over at Cleveland Clinic. And so I kind of wanted to show that, yes, I am very research heavy because by the time I entered into the fellowship, I was only about a year, not even 2 years after having defended. So I didn't really have other people to have a perspective of me and my growth as a scientist. And so that was kind of like my strategy. I had one from undergrad that I knew for over a decade, and then I had two from my graduate training.
I think it's a good balance, right? To cover to cover the career. I think too, it also kind of like goes into on who applies for the fellowship, right? And so obviously we have a ton of early career scientists. And so there was a question here on if you applied straight after your program or goes to freshman space first. So that's there. But I think the thing about us is it's a really unique group of people, right? Where you can get folks at so many different career stages, um, all kind of like doing this fellowship together. Um, Really quick question here is how they're asking how much detail did you give on your application for topics of interest that you would like to work on in your fellowship? And how did you convey that interest but still show flexibility in topics you could work on?
That's a great question. I highlighted two main things that I wanted to work on. One was within my research background, so it was glioblastoma. As I mentioned, there was a Senate resolution that was introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham. And so I mentioned that. I mentioned my background in glioblastoma. I mentioned some of like just surface level that this is a devastating disease that usually has no symptoms and all of a sudden you have symptoms and it's stage 4 brain cancer. And so that's something that like awareness is important. And so and also that resolution that Senator Lindsey Graham introduced had bipartisan support and sponsorship. So I mentioned that as well, that this is something that both sides of the aisle can get excited about. And I have the expertise to help this in some capacity. So I highlighted my research background and I drew in some of the congressional interest and awareness that was coming to it. Another area was, I mentioned briefly, like I was the graduate student council president for one of the years that I was in grad school. And during that time, I really did take a long observing eye of the graduate student welfare. And so graduate students at that time, there were a lot of them that were really enjoying their experience, but there were quite a few that were in longer PhD programs that were having a hard time. And I mentioned how I was talking with the president, and I also was working with our advisor. And, the Graduate Student Council had an advisor working with them. And so through that year, my platform was the graduate student experience on campus. And what ultimately ended up happening was that there was, after my year as president, there was the opening of the graduate student experience office that literally did a lot more to bolster the experience of the graduate students on that campus. And so that was something that I talked about in terms of advocating for the well-being of the student population at that time.
That makes sense, right? Which is all kind of like policy related and makes it work. Um, Question here about kind of like the process. Someone's asking if they're applying directly to an agency like the DOE or HUD, and if they need separate applications. And so to answer, it's you are applying to the program first, so you're applying for that executive branch, and then if you're selected as a finalist, that's when you start doing the process of figuring out which agency you would like to match to. But Liz, I don't know if you'd want to speak to maybe your process of being selected as a finalist and then going through how you actually just if you interview with different agencies and then maybe where you landed and why.
Yes. So being a biomedical researcher, I had heard PIs talk about the NIH. I even submitted some graduate predoctoral grant applications through the NIH. Um, and when I came into the fellowship, I was like, I'm not going to the NIH. I was like, I have heard enough about the NIH. And I came in with an open mind. I took a number of interviews at NSF. Um, I also did some interviews subsequently at the Treasury Department, DoD. And so I did a broad interviewing experience, but it was just the NIH that spoke to me the most. And I had to acknowledge that I'm just gonna go and go there. And so that's where I chose that. But yeah, you apply, you do the semifinalist step, and then you know that you're gonna be able to contribute to be a part of the interview week. And then you'll see who has solicited you for interviews. And I don't know if this is a will change, whether you could also solicit during my years, I was also able to solicit agency and their offices for interviews. And so it's kind of like an umbrella opening to the government through the executive branch.
No, I like hear you kind of like say your story about it. It's like it's almost kind of like you're choosing each other, right? And you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, right? And so I think for folks who kind of like take that process open-mindedly, I think that's how you get like the best of that situation and eventually land into a spot. That feels right. Let's see, looking through. Uh, I was wondering if you maybe want to talk about how you think applicants should tailor their CV or resume for STPF versus like a standard academic or job application. I think sometimes we try to discern ourselves with this is a fellowship program and you're trying to like having that you have this experience and that you have this like policy experience within our group of people. Did you approach it that way, and where it was kind of like different for applying for an academic posting, or was it more just kind of like I'm applying to a bunch of different things, and this is kind of like here's my resume for it?
I did my best to tailor my resume to the solicitation. So like what they were asking that they wanted to know. They were really specific. Someone put in the Q&A like extracurriculars, and that sparked my remembering that I did do that. I had an extracurricular, a number of things. I was involved in a number of student organizations, and so there was multiple levels of student advocacy that I had already had, and also just tutoring and volunteering things that I felt like showed my commitment to my community. Um, so when I tailored my resume, I literally sat down, I went through everything that they were asking, and I found different aspects of whatever I have done that I could utilize to meet that ask and provide details as to like the impact that I had in whatever I was doing.
I think that makes sense. Uh, looking through, I'm seeing a few questions on kind of like about pathways to policy and
Mm.
whether we'll be able to talk about like which agencies are going to be there or specific think tanks or nonprofits. And I think this goes into like a big issue of like how we are, thinking about the next couple of years and especially for this application cycle of where folks can be. And so, I think this is a real change moment for us, right? With which agencies folks can go to. They're not, there's a lot that's happening, right? And I think something that's sticking through with folks who are still applying to STPF is, kind of embracing this could be a challenging environment, right? And being open to what is available and like kind of like adjusting your skill set to that. I think in the past, like if you are set on like, oh, I want to have this very specific NIH experience, or I want to have this very specific NSF experience, and I think that's maybe not the what we're about as a program. I think it's, hey, we're seeing here's this policy need, and thinking through like if you are applying to something that like we're kind of building, I think it's like being able to open up to, hey, here's my skill set and here's where it can apply, and kind of like having that dual exchange. But that's kind of like where my head's sitting on like the staff perspective is like I think if you're an applicant right now, it's kind of like being open to a challenging environment, being open to uncertainty, but then also kind of like still leveraging, hey, like I want to use my experience for service in this arena and still being able to offer that. But that's kind of like where my head's at. Liz, I don't know if you had any, you've been in the program, but I don't know, and you're seeing what people are out getting up to, but I wanted to kind of like give you space if you had anything to say for that.
In regards to the pathways to,
Not just pathways, it's more about kind of like there's a lot of uncertainty. I think there's like hesitation. Um, but I think more so, kind of like being ready to embrace that and
Mhm.
applying for this program right now, right? I think it's if you were thinking that this is going to be, hey, everything's going to be built out super easy as like I don't know if this is the correct thing that you should like trying to be so eloquent in saying this, but I don't think that's like the right way to think about it, right? I don't think it's going to be this like, hey, I applied to STPF, I'm going to do this agency and then get out in 2 years versus like I think right now is a very kind of you have to be ready for a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Um, Especially like I think because I entered in 2023, and then experiencing an administration change, it's just different priorities. And so having to be flexible and agile and adjusting, was definitely crucial for me. And many other fellows, I think, would echo that same thing from my conversations with them.
Yeah. Um, Someone's asking, as a follow-up for you, of how it kind of maybe guided the rest of your career, um, in doing the fellowship and kind of like maybe what you do now and why, and if the fellowship kind of like impacted like what you would like to do going forward.
I think the fellowship was instrumental in me, I think being on the outside in when I was looking at different government positions, I did not understand how to cert, which is essentially like applying to a job listing and getting past that first hurdle of like, yes, your application is in the pool of considered applicants. I did not understand that. And so I think the fellowship was really helpful for me to be able to do that because I have prior to, the hiring freeze, applied and certed at a level that I felt that was like appropriate for where I am and where I was at the time that I did this. So that's something that this has been really helpful. And just to also tack on to that, that you're not an island and you're not alone. So when I was trying beforehand, it was just me talking to one friend that I knew that had gotten into a government agency. And then when I was doing it as a fellow, I had this whole group of alumni that had a wealth of knowledge to help advise me through. And so that was invaluable. And then also in terms of what I'm doing now, I'm still at a very pivotal point. I would love to stay in Washington, D.C. I feel like I would love to have the district be my home. Um, but I have been having a little bit of a hard time navigating, finding the kind of work that I would like to. So I'm still in the job market. I'm currently employed. I'm back in education. And I really am happy where I am right now because I am in DC, so that does matter. But I'm open. I've always followed the opportunities where they've taken me. So I'm from Florida, but I've lived in Connecticut. I've lived in Ohio. I'm now in DC and I will continue to move to where the opportunities open. But it's a different world once you're a fellow and once you're an alum because you just have your network exponentially grows. So it's better.
Yeah. Uh, you said network, and so something I was thinking about was had something here, kind of like maybe who you knew. before applying to the fellowship, or it's kind of like who you talk to about applying to the fellowship. I think something applicants do a lot is just talk to former fellows and, kind of like get that sense of, you know, understanding them before applying. But would you want to maybe share kind of like how important networking was, or having kind of like maybe talking to other folks who worked in science policy that you were able to use in your application?
It was instrumental. Um, Prior to applying, I did two approaches. I had the cold approach, where I was like on LinkedIn looking at different profiles, who is associated with this fellowship program because I'm interested and I want to apply. And I actually was trying to apply in 2019, 2020, and my dissertation got pushed back. So I ended up applying later, but the work that I did then was also helpful because it allowed me to already have a couple network people that I had known. So I did initially cold, reaching out through my LinkedIn networks and seeing who was a secondary connection. And then I also knew of, at the time when I was a graduate student, there was a postdoc at Case Western who had then went to move to DC and was in science back, she was in the NIH. And so I asked her, I was like, hey, I'm really interested in getting into science policy. And she connected me to two people within her office that she knew that were alumni and instrumental. So having those informational chats were really helpful, especially about like what approach did they take, hearing their story about their background and their career trajectory thus far, and then how they tailored their essays and statements was really helpful. I did see in the chat someone asking me how long it took me for my application, since I just mentioned it. I started right away. So I started twice, like as I mentioned, it was a false start because I wasn't defended, and you need to defend before you can be considered. So once I did defend, I applied the next application cycle. I started in June when it opened at that time. It lingered and lingered, and I took it seriously in September. So it wasn't even multiple months, but I crafted this essay, various essays and statements that were impactful enough for me to enter in. So, and I've heard people do it in a month, but I would definitely say give your reference letter writers as much time as possible.
Big agree on the references. I think it's so funny because people have such a breadth of connections and folks to reach out to. It's very funny for me. In like the last week of October, I'll usually hear from a lot of professors and folks who are like, I don't understand how to upload my letter of recommendation. But it's good that they're reaching out, right? It's good that they're asking. So our team is also here to make sure that that is happening. Um, Looking through, there was a question on kind of like maybe how you framed your career goals in the application. I think one thing to also think about before you answer, Liz, is, this isn't like a one size fits all, right? I think being able
Mhm.
to point to your own experiences and then, be comfortable in saying like, here's how this information can apply to me versus like, just going straight to like, hey, it's listed this way, let me do it this way. Um, but yeah, I wanted to throw it back to you on if you were able to kind of like frame your career goals in the application as that's getting built out.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned initially, I did not want to do a postdoc, did not want to be a PI. I knew that that wasn't the route for me. Um, And I also knew going to the NIH, the bulk of what the NIH does so well is they are programmatic. So grants are the bread and butter of the NIH, and they do it exceptionally well. But I knew that I did not want to be in program. So I wasn't sure whether me wanting to be on more administrative and the science policy landscape of, at the NIH could be. But that's something that very much so interested me. Like I mentioned, there was a hiring freeze towards the end, so I did have to pivot, and I pivoted back to education, which is where I was previously. Um, and my career goals, I kind of gave myself, and I'm giving myself this runway because I literally went from like, of course, elementary, middle, high school, undergrad, did a little bit of research in between undergrad and grad school. And then I went to grad school. And I was in grad school for some time. And it was a lot of schooling. And I kind of feel that these first 5 years after grad school are my exploratory phase. It's kind of like my postdoc, non-postdoc experience of like, what do I like to do? I have been in the government. I've had a great time in the government, and I do feel like I will come back to the government at some point in time. But I also am curious about other industries and under sectors and what how I can lend my skills there. Because one of the things I've learned is that you can do a lot with a PhD. It does not have to be the postdoc PI route. Um, and so I'm still exploring what that looks like. And so I'll let you know. But I will say that I do like science policy. So if I were to go back to the NIH, I'd go back in science policy area.
I No, I think all that makes sense in the sense of like, I think something about STPF too is I think we are really trying to pivot, or not pivot, but it's always been um, this is an experience, right? And like the idea of then taking scientists to have this policy experience and whether they go into a policy career has always been something that it's like we're pretty agnostic about, right? Like the amount of folks who do go back into academia or who go back into industry is fine, right? I think it's more about did we prepare scientists with policy experience and like have this all go through into the same bucket, right? So you can kind of like have that shared community. Um,
And I'll also
well,
add that there are individuals at the NIH that love program and you're closer to the research. You can, be on the side that is the program officer, or you can be the scientific reviewer, and you're closer to the research, you're looking at the grant proposals, you're talking with the PIs at time. And so I think that there are a lot of individuals that really do love that. That just didn't resonate with me. So just to mention that that is another option.
for sure. Um, talked about your interviews. Um,
I do see a question about someone saying that they've been in the workforce for a long time. Is that a barrier? And so I was an early career applicant, meaning I was less than 7 years out of my PhD in applying. Um, in my 2023 entry point year, there were a number of, I guess you would call it like there's early, mid, and late career. Um, Applicants that came in. There were a lot of late career applicants that came in, and I can't speak to their experience, but I did hear and did ask some of them, and they were like they wanted to change. They have, done what they're doing. They're really good at it, and they wanted to experience something different. And I think at every point, early, mid, and late, there's always something that you can add and bring of value. So I have seen many of late career fellows that are now alumni with me, and they have enjoyed it, and they've come through.
yep, definitely. I love kind of like having that range of folks, right? And I think that's part of the community building that you get to in DC and having in that whole space. Um, a question on if there's a branch or office that's like more industry related, and so somebody kind of saying if they could be placed into a branch that works directly in their industry, again, would kind of like point to how applying for the program is kind of like you want to bring your general skill set, and then obviously here's your expertise. But again, it doesn't mean that you have to do that too, right? I think like that's the flexibility in that matching process is seeing how your skill sets or your expertise may apply in different agencies that might not be directly associated, right? And I think like bring your expertise, bring your skill set, but it doesn't have to necessarily be in the agency you thought it was going to be. But just want to 10 times that as much as I can. Um, question on if you're not currently working, but will be starting your STPF application, should you include it in your CV or essay, or will this be better at the interview phase? I think it's more so you should talk about your experience. It doesn't have to be something that is highlighted, um, but can be something that you talk about in your interviews too. But yeah, wouldn't put a ton of onus on that. Uh, Still scrolling up. And Liz, if you see any too that speak to you, feel free. Okay.
Marab, maybe you know more details. I do believe that individuals have to be a US citizen for the program.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I will say, like, if you're not, there's also, if you would like to apply through a scientific society for the legislative branch, they have different requirements. So that might be a pathway. And then other science policy fellowships have different requirements. That is something for us that we have to navigate and have.
Mhm.
Um,
There was also a question about would it look bad if your PhD advisor is not included as a reference? So I will say I did not include my PhD advisor. I included my co-mentor. So, and my PhD was a little interesting. And so, as I mentioned, I had three reference writers. One was from my time at Yale University doing some research in a gastroenterology lab. The second reference writer was the head of my thesis committee. He was the chair of my thesis committee, but also the chair of the immunology training program within the pathology department. And so he had a unique experience in seeing me from one lab, because I was started off in one lab in my PhD, and then ended up in a second lab, and that's where I defended. So he was my chair across both the labs. And then I had a co-mentor. So this co-mentor was my co-mentor in my first lab, since my PI in my first lab, I was his first graduate student. And so she brought a lot of expertise that he just didn't have yet. And so she was my co-mentor, and she stuck on as my co-mentor through my second lab as well. And I chose to not have, of course, I just didn't choose to have either of my PhD mentors um, write a letter of recommendation for me. I felt that having those individuals that saw me across both of those lab experiences were stronger. And it did not impact my ability to be considered as a strong candidate.
no, I think that's perfect to say out. I think first and foremost, you want to be confident that someone's going to write a positive letter of recommendation for you, right? And so I think our committee, our selection committee, also knows that like not every environment you're coming from is a perfect one, right? So being able to have folks who can speak to your skill sets and know who you are and that will be positive, I think is very important for the process. And so I think like we've had cases before where, we see a very negative letter of rec from someone and our committee can see through that, like, okay, this won't really hurt the applicant. It was more about this reference didn't really maybe should have recused themselves from writing a reference, right? So be careful. Like I would be thoughtful about who you have, and again, all those things of do they know you well? Can they speak to different sides of you? And also that would ultimately be positive, but very much understand that not everyone comes from a very positive environment. So important. Yeah, so there's another question in here about kind of what's the best way to write about your skills if you don't really know the role an agency might play in or a nonprofit might play in if you're thinking about PPF. Um, I don't know, Liz, if you maybe want to tackle it, but like thinking about how to still write about your skills, even if you don't know formally where you might get placed, um, and to answer that one.
Yeah, I think writing in a way that is transferable. And so, for instance, during my PhD, I did have a collaboration with an external lab from my university. I regularly had meetings with someone in that lab that I coordinated and set up. And so talking about that in of itself is a skill set of I checked in with XYZ collaborators on a regular basis. I provided updates on my end. I asked probing questions on their end, just trying to help our research move forward. And then I would share those updates with my PI and them with theirs. And so that in of itself is an example of a skill set in which can be transferable into some capacity, whether you're in one organization and there are multiple departments. And so communicating collaboratively across departments, something that you can also highlight. So there's a lot of ways in which you can frame whatever skill sets you have and how you gain those skills that could be applicable beyond in diverse ways.
Yeah, and we have this listed out in a rubric, right? There's like a point system, and we can drop it in the chat of like, here's kind of like what we're looking for as a science communicator. Here's kind of like what we're looking for in your science expertise, right? I don't know if that was something that you looked at at all. I feel like I give that to folks, but it's not maybe the most used resource of like looking exactly at the rubric to maybe tailor your application to.
I think it could be helpful. I think
Sure.
different people will take different approaches, and so maybe it resonates with someone out there.
Okay. Ooh, there's somebody who is currently in a state policy position, and they're asking like what might be a good way to highlight that as experience, but still highlight how different the federal level is in applying to us. So it's a good question because I think sometimes we'll say that like, we're not really looking for policy experts to come into the program and, thinking through like how we get more scientists to get that policy experience. But for somebody who has a little bit or has that state experience, still thinking about how to maybe do that on the federal side here at AAA through AAAS. Um, I mean, I don't know if you have anything, Liz, before I kind of like go into my spiel. Like you should apply still.
I think you should go into your spiel and I'll see if I have anything in there.
Yeah, I think the
Yeah,
spiel is really just you should still apply. I think you have this like experience here, and being able to transfer that on the federal lens in this moment in this environment can be something that people really that can still really resonate with the selection committee and having that adjustability, that flexibility in the process, I think would serve you um, in that too. While again, still kind of like highlighting the different ways that you can still grow. I think is like the thing that we're thinking about is can you like kind of like can you still receive a lot of that experience here that you might not have gotten on the state side. Because it'll happen in reverse too, right? People will do the federal fellowship and then maybe go back to their states and do the state policy side, which is more than great, right? Like I think being able to have more scientists in those spaces is the ultimate goal.
absolutely. I think it will lend itself in the federal space. I think you'll find that there are a lot of transferable skills. Again, transferable. There's a lot of transferable skills that you will have gained in the local space that will be applicable in the federal.
Cool. And then I think we can get the STPF rubric in the chat if that's something we can do. If well, so that'll be out there for everyone. Um, okay. Seeing a question for someone who would maybe, how would they suggest approaching the application if they've been on hiatus from their path of study for several years since graduation, but want to return? I think it kind of like goes back into like what we've been saying earlier, right? Like being able to highlight your skill set, where you think it can be impactful. Um,
Mhm.
I think obviously like what did you like? I think oh, what did you also do during your hiatus too? I think can be important, right? Like what are the things that are transferring from what you were doing during that time could also be here too. But nothing, not a lot for me to add. I don't know if you have anything on that list.
Yeah, I would just add like I don't know what the hiatus was, but I did have a small hiatus between when I defended and when I started working. It was
Mhm.
less than a year, but definitely more than 6 months. And so during that time, I volunteered. I did some communications work, and that was something that I was able to highlight within my application.
definitely. So we're getting close to the last 10 minutes. And so, Liz, I'm going to hit you with one last errata, maybe sort of for us. But to close, what are the top three things you wish you had known before applying to STPF that you learned only through experience?
But sorry, can you say the last part?
That you learned only through experience. So, top three things that you wish that you learned after now being alumni.
Okay. I feel like the top three things I learned is I would say number one is, and I talk about this and I will not stop talking about it because I will continue to brag about it, is the alumni network is amazing. It's, I have played team sports and it's kind of like that. It's like, think about people getting together towards a common goal. And I played volleyball, so I was a middle blocker. But we also have a setter and we have a libero. And everyone's wanting to win. Everyone's wanting to do their part. And the alumni network is similar in that people want you to succeed. They often were in your shoes, know what it's like, and learn something along the way that they can impart onto you and help you in your journey. Um, it's a very supportive environment. And I mean, you'll find your people. Whether you like gaming, whether you like plants, whether you like whether you're a parent, you have those little ones you're looking after or older adult kids that are looking to support in whatever capacity. There is a lot of subgroups within the alumni network that could resonate with you. And I just think that the alumni are what makes this program so special. So yeah, I'm grateful for it.
That's a
Those are
good.
the
That's
things.
a good one.
Okay, I got off of my soapbox about that. What was the question? I have two more things to share, but I
Yeah.
forget.
No, go ahead. Yeah, that's it. So two things, two more things that you knew that you wish you had known before applying to STPF.
Okay. They do mention it, but the alumni network is amazing. Number two would be I don't know. I personally just love DC. So I didn't know how much I would love living in DC. I am from a city. I'm from Miami, Florida, and so I prefer city life, but I love living in DC. I love that there are three nearby airports that you can get to and get anywhere. Like I literally flew to England and back just a month or so ago and love that. But to keep it fellowship related, I would also say that something I didn't know prior to applying was that I showed up to my program office hours all the time. Like, I don't really think they understood when I saw them at orientation. I was like, I'm gonna come to your office hours often. And they're like, yeah, okay, that's fine. And I literally was like steadily there, like at least twice a month. It was held weekly. And I just found them to be so incredibly helpful and just being a sounding board of like navigating certain things within my placement office. Um, yeah, very supportive, extremely supportive. Um, so I talked about the alumni network, briefly talked about DC, talked about my program officer, and I'll add a bonus thing in there. Um, I think the 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 bonus would be just the experience, like being in certain rooms, being a part of certain conversations. Sometimes I found myself wanting to shy away from like, oh, I might not know, and it's okay to not know because you will realize that there are people that are in the offices that were once upon a time new there as well, and they could be of help and be a resource. And so I think this my experience was that I can get on my soapbox, but I'm gonna try to put it away right now and say that I really had a great experience in what I learned, the exposure that I had, the conversations that I grew through, the different tasks that I learned through. Like I talked about the congressional justification and navigating and coordinating that for the whole NIH. It was a huge experience, and I wouldn't have had it otherwise. So yeah.
Yeah, I think all that to say is like there's so much beyond just like the placement, right? And just the community, the support, right? I think
Hmm.
lots of moments of adversity, right? That can happen, but I think being supported by being around all of that, and I love DC too. I think DC is such a fun, great city, and so
Yeah.
I think kind of like having that all be in the mix, I think is our biggest selling point. And having fellows like you to help promote the program and asking folks to apply. So thank you so much, Liz. I think we'll get
Absolutely.
to the last few minutes and some more housekeeping items from there. So thank you again for being here. Okay. So we've said this a lot. The deadline is still November 1st. I saw some questions in the chat that are probably meant for us directly at staff. So please reach out to the fellowships at AAAS.org email, or we can talk to you there as well. November 1st deadline. Again, this means finishing verification and having your letters of recommendation all submitted. We know there's a lot that goes into submitting a complete application, and so our team is here. We're still here, and we're monitoring the inbox. So if you have questions or need support, please reach out, and we'll do that for you. But for folks who have attended all of our chats or just attending this one, really appreciate you stopping by, making the time. And really appreciate the patience and flexibility in the different little timing of our application cycle this window. So appreciate you being here. Please let us know if you have questions. And with that, good luck and click submit before November 1st.